Are we ready to go? Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hi. My name's Belle True, and I am a Middle East correspondent for the Independent newspaper in London. And today's panel is entitled The End of the World, and I would argue that that is not too much of a dramatic title. The United Nations released a report last year that said that we are the last generation that can prevent irreparable damage to our planet. They gave us about 11 years to make serious changes. I think that was quite a shock for a lot of people who don't work on this issue. People began waking up to the crisis. I certainly have. I've noticed a change already over the last few years in journalism. No longer is environmental journalism or climate change relegated to the back pages of newspapers or the science section or obscure TV features. It's front page splashes. And that's because the crisis is right now. And I'm not an environmental journalist, I'm a Middle East correspondent, but recently I experienced some of these issues over a series that I've been working on. For 8 months, I've been working on a series called Water Wars that looks at water in conflict in the Middle East and North Africa. And I was quite shocked at just how much climate issues, the environment, had bled into the conflicts that I cover. I was looking at it through the narrow frame of water shortages, but they had sparked international conflicts, local wars. It was behind an increase in violence against women. Water shortages had brought down governments. It was behind epidemics of diseases. Even water shortages, droughts were behind the recruitment to jihadi groups, like in northern Iraq with the so-called Islamic State. For me, it was quite shocking to see just how much what had been an obscure sort of subject in journalism had bled into the conflicts that we know very well from the news. And I think this is a paradigm shift that we're living at the moment, and we as journalists and consumers of news need to recognize that. Environmental journalism, climate change journalism is no longer just a section on itself. It's very much bled into all aspects of news, whether that's business or health or, like me, being a Middle East correspondent. And as journalists, we have a responsibility to work on these issues, to identify, to highlight these issues to the world and drive that change, because we simply don't have enough time left. We have 11 years, according to the United Nations. So as I said, I'm just a Middle East correspondent. I am no expert, but I have today a panel of people who actually know what they're talking about. And that is why I wanted to do this today. We're going to look at the problems that we're facing in terms of climate change and the environment. We're going to narrow in on one region, the Middle East, that's under huge amounts of pressure. We're going to look at the problems that environmental journalists are facing, because they're beginning to really face quite a lot of violence from different regimes because of what they're uncovering. And finally, we're going to end with looking at practical solutions that journalists or even just consumers of news can use to track pollution or environmental crises with open source data we all have access to. So I'm hoping this panel today will not only highlight a key issue, but give us some tools to be able to work on it. Because certainly, as just a Middle East correspondent, I found it quite overwhelming when I discovered what I did. So without further ado, I would like each panelist to just briefly introduce themselves. We'll start at the far right with Sven.
Yeah, hello. My name is Sven Egenter. I'm the editor-in-chief and founder of the Clean Energy Wire, a news service on the energy transition and a journalism network.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Wim Zwijnenburg. I work as a program leader at PAX, a Dutch peace organization based in the Netherlands, and we work on conflict and environmental issues, mostly in the Middle East.
Hello, everyone. My name is Louise Sahan. I work as a freelance environment and science journalist, and I've been focusing on environmental issues across the Middle East for the past 12 years. It was mostly based in Egypt.
Okay, so I think we'll start with Sven in the far right. Sven, could you, I guess, answer the question that the panel title is this the end of the world?
Well, thank you, Belle, first of all, for having me invited to this panel, and thank you all for your interest in this subject, which is indeed vital to start with. And maybe, I don't know, I'm not a tech whiz. Can somebody put the screen of I'm having in front of me up here briefly? Because usually I use at this point, my little helper here, not to Google something on the smartphone, but to use the smartphone case to make my case, actually, which is the same thing that you're seeing up here. I don't know who knows that chart, but that is the answer of, where are we heading? What are we facing, actually? We're seeing, these are called the warming stripe. due to the climate scientist Ed Hawkins, and it shows the temperature curve. These are the global average temperatures over the last 150 years. Left is 1850-ish around, and then you go to the right, that's where we are, and I think the last year is actually missing, which would be a little bit darker even. And to answer your question, well, is this the end of the world? Are we heading to get all toast, basically? Somebody else has just said, well, this shows where we are right now, but the question really is, if I can get it not to work, here. Which way are we heading? That's the question we are facing now. Somebody just took scenarios for the future and put them up in a chart, and the big question is, are we going to go up left and get into a really dire scenario, or are we going to go down right? So let me just explain very briefly 2 sentences about the Clean Energy Wire, because we are working with foundation funding to get us pretty much down on that path on the right-hand side through measures that will prevent the worst in terms of climate change from happening, from temperature rise from happening. Our home base is Germany. We're based in Berlin. We're a news service on the energy transition, but we're also a journalist network with now over 120 international journalists globally active on this very important subject. And we try to make exactly that happen, what Bell has mentioned. We try to see the work, the fact of climate change and the work that's done to prevent the worst from happening as a cross-section journalistic challenge and a journalistic beat. We do that in our daily work. Now, to illustrate, why that might be important, I have a question to the audience actually straight away. Could you just, if you think that you personally, in your daily life, are already affected by climate change in the widest sense, could you just put up your hand? I don't know how much of it is now the sort of like peer pressure, but yeah, there are some people who are really putting up their hands. I would say, and I would make the case that actually all hands should have gone up, and I will explain why, and why this is important that we as journalists do that all the time and every day. Because so far, climate change reporting has always focused largely on the sort of like, what's the drama that's going to happen, and we all know these stories, and we would all probably know a story that tells you all about the dire consequences if climate change, will happen unstopped is a difficult way of phrasing it, unhindered. We all read that in environmental pieces about melting ice caps and glaciers, droughts, thawing permafrost, water shortages, changing weather patterns, severe storms, and all these things that Bell has already mentioned. But I want to focus, and that's what we do in our work, on the second part of that story, which is like, what are we actually doing to slow it down? And ultimately, and it's fair to say the world has subscribed to that since the Paris Agreement of 2015. This is going to be about getting rid of all the stuff that heats the atmosphere up. The formal word for that is decarbonization, but forget about it. It's ultimately about changing our economy, our society, our ways of life, the way we act and interact, from using energy sources and stuff, basically, that creates greenhouse gases that warm up the atmosphere, to forms of, doing economy, business, science, that, and interact socially, being mobile, that don't. And that's the bottom line, and there you can already see why you should have all put your hands up, because in many ways, a lot of the things are underway to make that happen. And these stories create a special challenge for journalists, but also a special opportunity, actually, because, again, it's about the core of what journalism needs to do. It's a big responsibility. we need to raise awareness, we need to alert the public, we have to show the solutions, we have to hold those responsible and in charge to account and shed light on the hidden vested interests, the legitimate ones and the not so legitimate ones as well. And so that leads me to a second question to the audience. Now, among the journalists here, who covers, let's say, business? Hey, one, hello. Good. Good that you're here. You're special welcome to our business reporter. Who would say doing social, social society stories, social, welfare, housing? One, good. Three. Mobility, another one. And environment? That's the majority, so you're here for a reason. But the others are here for a reason as well, because this, as I've explained, this shift away ultimately obviously creates stories across all sections. And the impact is so massive on all these. Business is a perfect example. There are now more and more businesses that think about business models that do not emit greenhouse gases. There's the obvious ones, there's the renewables industry, but that is now filtering down to many, many, many more businesses. And if you don't understand that there is a big mega trend towards low carbon, as it says, behind that, you're missing some of the big stories that are coming your way. Think car industry, the diesel debate, Germany, big story there. Think about cement making. I think we have an interesting example here from one of the colleagues on the ground where, which emits a lot of carbon the way it's made. So they are facing challenges. But it's not only businesses, it's also, everything that has to do with our everyday life, the way we move, which cars we use, do we use a car, should we fly, the way what we eat. All these questions are directly linked to this shift away, and it creates massive stories, and it creates massive business opportunities, and it creates massive frictions. And that's also where environmental journalists need to be very tuned into this story, because not only them, but everyone. As Bell has said, we are moving away from where this is hidden in the science section, because it's getting into the middle of the debate of politics, of business, and of social debates. And that makes it sometimes also a bit harder, because the answers are not always clear-cut. Some things, some business models that are good in reducing climate-harming greenhouse gases might have other environmental impacts that are worth looking at. So wind farms are a classic example. So you need to balance, what you're doing there and how you report on that, because it's not black and white. It's not all poor birds versus bad windmills, nor great windmills versus, who cares birds. And ultimately, that spills over up to, questions of security, and I'm sure that Louise and then Wim as well will shed some more light on the security, migration. All these elements that journalists cover have a very strong energy transition, climate angle to them. Now, one thing, and then I'll hand back to you, is so far from our work, where we tried at the Clean Energy Wire to run this as a sort of cross-cutting from the beginning. Our focus is the energy transition, but we cover electricity, mobility, business, efficiency, politics, and international relations under the prism of energy transition. Our takeaway so far: journalists of all beats should be tuned into this mega trend. Environmental journalists have a big role to play, be watchful to get the balance right. And journalists must think outside their usual reporting boxes, in terms of sources, but also in terms of ways of working. And at that, I would leave it, because otherwise I'm snatching away too much time.
What you raised there are some really important and complicated, complex issues. I just want to ask you a very quick question, and I'm sure everyone in the audience is thinking this as well. What can we do to cover these issues, or what can we do to work on this? What tips, maybe let's say 3 tips you give for people on the ground, whether we're environmental journalists or Middle East correspondents or people working in business or social mobility, whatever it is?
Well, basically builds on what I was just saying. It's work with your colleagues. Think cross-speed. You're not a business journalist in that sense. You need to get some climate in. You're not an environmental journalist alone. You need the expertise maybe of a mobility colleague on certain issues. So really think cross-speed and think internationally. Think cross-border. Don't make up a story about a faraway country. Get in touch with somebody. Collaborate with colleagues with special expertise, different perspectives, get rid of your bias, different nationalities, and consider unusual allies on this reporting, especially if you're an environment reporter. You have probably a tendency to be mistrustful of businesses and their interests, which is a fair point, but there are a lot of businesses now that invest a lot of time and money to get into these mega trends, and they have good experts, like insurers now. You get institutions on NGOs that focus on business, like We Mean Business, for instance. And then there are people like in the military who are really concerned about these stories, and they are really good experts on some of the stuff, when it comes to the consequences these changes will have. You can talk to trade unions about the social implications of these shifts. So think about the unusual source in this sense and try to get out of that box and use new tools. And ultimately, if you're really stuck, send us an email. We've created this wonderful network, and I just want to put that up quickly, of journalists focusing on this specific question. And I'm sure someone across the world on our network will have a tip for a contact or an expert.
Thank you very much, Sven, for that. I'm going to move now to Louise, and we're going to zero in a little bit on a particular part of the world. So the Middle East, which obviously is suffering quite severely from climate change, environmental issues for many different reasons. Louise, you set up the first environmental news desk in the Middle East region, if that's right?
In Egypt.
In Egypt, sorry. I'm just getting carried away with myself now. In Egypt. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that and also your experiences of covering environmental issues in the Middle East, so we can zero in on a particular example.
Okay. So yeah, I think it's actually an interesting story how this environment section first appeared, because I would say in certain ways it found its roots in the Egyptian revolutions. So basically we were working with my newspaper covering the demonstrations, the sitting in Tahrir Square. And they were people who were there actually taking care of the trash. And there were people sweeping the floors, and there were people repainting some of the curbs. And I had been doing a little bit of environmental reporting before, and I was just wondering what is happening. And so at the time, I didn't have time to really think about what was happening, to be honest. But it happened later that I thought, okay, I think people all of a sudden realized that their actions as an individual, as a collective, can have an impact on their country, on their politics. And so all of a sudden, it created this renewed sense of ownership and also a sense of responsibility to take care of what you have for your ecosystem, for your nature, for how things are working. And so the section happened then. And we didn't really know what we were doing to start with. I mean, no one else was doing this in Egypt, and we had, very basic understanding of what the environment was. So we decided to just do everything because we had complete freedom. I don't think our editors really knew what we were doing either, so it was a pretty brilliant place to work. And so we started, it was me and just a couple writers. We were very young. It was 2011, and we decided, okay, we're going to talk about water. We're going to look into farmers' rights, like farmers' struggles. We want to just touch everything. And so that was obviously for many, many years, that was a very interesting time. And it was actually possible to do that in Egypt because I don't think anybody was really looking in terms of, the government was not really looking at what people covering environment were doing. Like there were so many political things going on at that time. So we had quite a lot of freedom to report on what we wanted to do. But then, what was happening as well is at that specific period, so in the wake of the revolution, because of the political upheaval, there was a lot of, a very dire lack of law enforcement, and that also had a very dire impact on ecosystems. And so you had a lot of urban encroachment that was going on, and this is I mean, this makes sense in a country like Egypt and the Middle East because this is the fastest urbanizing region in the entire world. And so, because the authorities were not looking, a lot of the countryside, a lot of the delta was pretty much covered in concrete. We lost like thousands of acres of arable land in a country that has very little. It's about 4%, and that's where everyone is. Everyone lives, all the industries are. So you can't really afford to lose all this land. So we were covering this. But then again, it turns out that because I think the government in the Middle East, not just in Egypt, started realizing a little later than other places that the environment had the potential to destabilize politically the region. And so there was a lot of suspicion, and this made our work a little bit more difficult. And so that was in Egypt, and that was absolutely everywhere else. There's just one example of one story that I was following. So right after the revolution, there was a big problem of energy shortages, and so the government didn't have much electricity to give away, and they decided to prioritize the population versus the industry just because they didn't want to deal with yet another uprising. So the cement industry, that's a huge industry in Egypt, had their production capacity fall by over 40% in the last 3 years that followed, and they were functioning on natural gas. And so under Morsi, just a few months before Morsi was deposed in 2013, this is the time where we realized that Egypt was actually planning to import coal. Egypt doesn't even have coal, but they thought it was a brilliant idea to actually export it from South Africa, China, Europe, depending on the prices.
Could you just quickly, for the audience, explain why that would be a problem using coal, just for people who wouldn't know?
I mean, for just like, many things. The handling of it, it's hard to imagine that the maintenance and actually getting it there would not be extremely destructive in the ports, so on the coral reefs, and then on the way to the people. I think that's mostly the problem, like the destruction, like the deposits on coral reefs, in the water, sleeping in the water, and then on people's health when you actually use it.
In terms of people's chests and lungs.
Yeah.
Karen, so you were saying. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, it's cool. Good. And so basically I heard about this before it was officially announced through some activists, environmental activists, who gave me this information, and I decided to cover this. And I did cover it by also talking to the cement lobby and writing about their own perspective as well, and they had some valid criticisms towards the government that ensured them that they would have access to natural gas forever, and now they had to change their kilns and bear the costs of all this. And what happened is I did maybe 3 or 4 stories, and at that time that was for Mada Masr, which is the leading independent voice in Egypt, just so you guys know. There's a few people here who know it. Anyway, and what happened is a few months later I traveled, and then systematically whenever I would fly back into Cairo airport, I would just be stopped and put on the side for hours, systematically, never knowing whether I could go in. And I know intelligence officials also came to my building and asked about me. So the whole idea was to basically pressure me into deciding on my own volition to go. They didn't want to go through the trouble with my embassy to actually kick me out, like they did with Bell. So that didn't happen. But
it's a different story.
It's a different story. Anyway, so this is one of the examples of how you believe you are doing some work that is, yes, of course it's extremely political because you're talking about energy, but you're looking at it in a different way, but still it is risky in some parts of the world. And I think the biggest reason for this is that in a lot of developing countries, there's this opposition that's created between economic development and environmental protection. And so systematically the government would go for an economic development because this is seen as the priority. And so you're a bit annoying if you're focusing on the consequences of that. Just really quickly, there's a couple other challenges that I see.
I was going to say, I mean, do you, in terms of, you highlighted there how you were basically chased by the state because of your reporting on environmental,
Yeah.
or at least put pressure on? I mean, what kind of specific challenges that do environmental journalists face? Because there's obviously a lot of discussion about what, let's say, a Middle East correspondent faces in terms of...
Yes.
But, you know, environmental journalists, I guess everyone in their mind thinks that they sort of sit around looking at penguins, and that's it. But, like, obviously that's not the case. We're talking about serious, you know, confrontations with governments.
I think one of the things that's really difficult to access is data. There's not much data that's serious, so it's like, it's not necessarily collected in the right way. It's not accessible. It might be there, but just accessible to the minister, and maybe even him doesn't know. Like, so this is a problem, because if you do environmental journalism, if you don't want your reporting to sound like anecdotes after anecdotes, you need to have data so you can actually, you know, like show the severity of a phenomenon. Otherwise, it just doesn't show much. And this is really hard, and this is getting worse. A few years ago, I was doing a story on food security in Egypt, because they're currently expanding agriculture into the desert, and most of that will be the water will be used, will come from the groundwater. And so this, obviously, this is fossil water. It's non-renewable at all. Like, there's no water in this part of Egypt that ever falls in the shape of rain. So I was just trying to get information of what's the volume of water that's contained in this aquifer, and I could never find that. So basically, you have this huge development going on, and we don't know whether it's viable for 5, 10, 20 years. Like, literally no one knows. This is high security information that you cannot access. So this is a bit of a problem. Yeah, I mean, I see that. Oh, and also, right now, it's, even if you want to talk to scientists and you want to talk to experts and academics, there's, people are quite scared to talk. Yeah. So they will not talk if they can avoid it. Even if, I don't know, you might want to just talk to someone who is an expert in water pollution, and this is what they do, right? They take samples and they come up with like different numbers. They can tell you of the quality of the Nile, the groundwater, and they will never, they don't talk to you. And that's recent. That's like the couple last years, just very difficult.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying about the lack of data. I mean, it's certainly something that I've faced just in my last 8 months of reporting on water. I mean, sometimes I was just in South Sudan a few weeks ago, and they just don't, like, one of the key issues they have is that they've never had anyone do any surveys, so they just don't even know how much water they have or don't have. But, you know, when I was in Iraq last year looking at the Basra water crisis, which actually Sven and I were talking about this yesterday, we think the Basra water crisis might have been an instance where actually, like, climate issues were made quite international because there were these massive protests and lots of violence, and Prime Minister lost his job pretty much over it. But again, there was a lot of fear there from officials to come forward, and different wings of the government were sort of fighting each other. And I mean, in the process of that reporting, I actually ended up having a kidnapping threat against me. So, you know, environmental journalism is no longer just something that, as I said, is done from the outside. It's very real, it's very difficult, as you were saying. And I think this nicely segues now into Wim, because you obviously work a lot on what basically on how you can use open source data to track. Like, so let's say we can't get hold of the data from officials, or it's difficult to actually access those areas. You work a lot on using like satellite imagery and things. So I would be really interested to know like what kind of skills that people can use, either as environmental journalists or just normal journalists, or even just consumers of news, to work on that issue. And I mean, I think it's particularly interesting because you work with an NGO that actually works on conflict and peace building, and yet you're actually working in the environmental issues a lot of the time, which I think really underlines everything that we're working on, talking about in this panel. So I guess we'll just start, before we move into the skills section, we'll just start with that question. Like, I mean, how does an NGO that works for peace and on conflict end up working on the environment?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having us on this panel. And yeah, I think that's the challenge on that. So PAX is an NGO working on peace building, and we're working over 15 different conflict zones. And it was, I think, back in 2010, 2011, where our program in Iraq we're working with local partners there on peace building processes, and they were approaching us saying, okay, we're concerned about like health impacts on the decades of conflict. So you have the Iran-Iraq war, the two Gulf wars with the impact of the environment, like massive destruction of the oil industry, the date palms, water pollution. The US used a lot of depleted uranium emissions there, where people were concerned about what the health impact was, but nobody actually looked into like what was the relationship between concerns and was there an actual problem or not. So they approached us saying, okay, nobody's looking into this, and then we start looking, trying to get information, going back to the data side. We want to know from the US, like, okay, how much depleted uranium did you fire and where? So they didn't give the information, so we have to find out ourselves. So we did freedom of information requests with the Pentagon and together with various partners. And that took years and years to finally get the data, and then we could find out where it was. And as UN Environment, which is responsible for doing post-conflict environmental assessments, they did a lot of work, but a lot of the work, the recommendations they made after their assessment were not implemented, or usually the environment never has a priority in conflict settings. Because when you think about the environment, people think about bees and butterflies and that kind of stuff. So if you're working on conflict, they ask you like, hey, why are you working on the environment in conflict? Like, are you like looking into separating waste or that kind of stuff? And it's like, no, it's actually people are concerned about their health, because as soon as the guns fall silent and people move out and the media moves out, and there's pollution because somebody targeted a phosphate factory next to a river, or a massive amount of the water infrastructure has been destroyed, so people don't have access to water or they can't use it for irrigation, it affects their livelihoods. There are numerous examples. And we sort of noticed in that period, okay, nobody's actually looking into this apart from the UN. And so we started looking at conflicts and in that period, like the revolution in Syria turned into full blown out conflict. There was the civil war in Ukraine starting in 2015, and in the Donbas region, for example, in Ukraine, it's like massively Soviet-style heavy industry, and it was like fighting going on there, and there were all these chemical factories there, and toxic waste ponds like next to the firing lines. And there's still at the very moment a big risk of an environmental disaster. And what you mentioned as well, like it was missing. Nobody was actually reporting on it. Nobody was collecting the data. So occasionally there was like indeed anecdotal stories were coming out, but like you didn't have the data. It was difficult to visualize. So you can visualize someone stepping onto a landmine and saying, okay, there's an issue with landmines. But how do you visualize someone getting sick or as an outbreak of disease, because it's less visible, so it's less tangible for people. So that's why we start looking into using open source information, and this also came with the rise of open source investigations from folks like from Bellingcat. And for those who are interested, we're doing a workshop later with Bellingcat at 5 o'clock at the hotel, where we dive more into several issues. So just quickly outline why we think environmental journalism is needed. So we have like direct long-term pollution or impacts on the environment, like destruction of forests. We have lack of environmental governance in and after conflict. There's the release of pollutants from targeting of oil industries or chemical industries that can impact the environment directly through and health because of air pollution. So we've seen the burning oil wells in Guyana in 2016, which were put on fire by ISIS, were burning for 8 months. It was next to an IDP camp with 20,000 people. 20 people directly died because also a sulfur factory was put on fire, and it was a massive toxic cloud. Like 20 people, I think, died, and 1,000 people were hospitalized. And then there was the oil well fires that was monitored pretty well, because it's like this is in Guyana, and that's the stuff that gets into the media, because then you get burning oil wells. It makes good pictures. Like every media company in the world was there because you have all these burning oil wells, but nobody looked into that afterwards. So, like, what happens after the oil wells are out? Are people reporting on the communities who are affected, their concerns, because they've been living in these conditions for a long time. And it's low priority. So, it's not to put the blame on the media on this, but like I can understand, like you have to invest in stories, but do you also invest in follow-up? Like what happens a year after, or do you look into the less obvious reasons why, how the environment is damaged and how it impacts health or the future of the people who are living there? So, for example, Pete Schwartzstein is a journalist who's been reporting on the Middle East a lot, and he did some great research on the drought and the impact in northern Iraq and how it affected agriculture and the consequences for politics and how it helped raising, as Bel mentioned, an example as well on raising support for local farmers to join ISIS. And it's one example of journalism where people invest in long-term research on these kind of issues. And also, affected communities and individuals often don't feel heard. So, because it's less visual and it's difficult also to see the link, like causality. Why are people getting sick? Is it because of the environment, or is it because, it's a thing with depleted uranium. It was really difficult because people were complaining about all kind of health effects, and because the Saddam regime was always putting out this propaganda saying the US has contaminated Iraq with radioactive contamination, and everybody was freaking out because they were broadcasting commercials on TV back in the late 90s, the Iraqi regime. So everybody, if you talk to doctors, people came to the hospital saying, "Doctor, I have a headache, it's probably because of depleted uranium." Just a side note, depleted uranium is like a heavy metal, it's slightly radioactive, which was 400,000 kilograms were fired by the US in 2003 without being cleaned up. But so there's a legitimate problem there. But it also, the other side was that, if people are getting sick, why do they get sick? And of course, everybody started to point at one single issue, but it's probably more complex than that because a lot of people smoke. There's other health conditions that made the things worse. So causality and complexity hinder, and I can also understand why it's difficult to cover that, because how do you make that link between getting sick and what's happening? So we try to look at, okay, how can we do research on conflict pollution? So here's an example where you see two images here. One is public information. It's the Sentinel data by the European Union. It's free satellite imagery, which we used. And then there's high resolution satellite imagery. And we looked into artisanal oil refining sites, which were popping up in Syria and Iraq post-2014. So those are people who are refining crude oil themselves by just heating it up. It's very toxic stuff because you get exposed to all the smoke, and a lot of children are working in that. And we used satellite imagery to document where this was happening. And in Syria, we found over 300 clusters with over a couple of 30, 40,000 refineries. There's an oil spill we found in Hamreen Mountains in Iraq, where ISIS was trying to extrude oil with handmade stuff, which went wrong and then created an 11-kilometer oil spill. And we worked together with local reporters from Iraqi Oil Report, which is a company that's supporting or reporting on the oil industry in Iraq. And they sent out local reporters there to verify, indeed what we saw on satellite imagery is also visible on the ground. So it was an agricultural area. So, and just here are some thoughts on what we can do before I try to close this presentation. But so what I mentioned, conflict areas are difficult to have access to, so you can use remote data collection for finding out information on what's happening. It's just not for conflicts, but probably also for environmental crimes. It's happening on, for example, in Armenia, where a mining company was expanding on gold mines in Colombia, in Nigeria. So it's also an issue, it's also an opportunity for people. There's a lot of data sets where you can have access to. Smartphones, people use a lot of smartphones everywhere, and they put information online, and you can take that information, you can geolocate where it is, you can collect information from that images, which helps you, if you don't have access to areas, it helps you understand what's happening on the ground. The other available open source data, so there are a lot of data sets everywhere. Again, come to the workshop later, but just to give you a flavor of what can be done. Remote sensing is happening a lot, which help to visualize things and help document impacts. And there's new technologies which, so combining technologies or methods to understand what's happening. So for example, in Syria, we used a model which is used in humanitarian, in natural disaster response. So for example, if a chemical factory was destroyed and they send over a humanitarian response to deal with that, they need to know how toxic is that stuff. So they build this model on if it's an agricultural site or it's textile industry. So if it's textile industry, probably a lot of solvents, which are highly toxic. So what we did in Syria, we started to use that same model, but then applying it to Aleppo, to Homs, and look at all the sites that were targeted, and we used open source information to find out where all the factories were, what kind of chemicals were in there, or power plants which have a lot of PCBs, and then start to map it and say, okay, this power plant was targeted and destroyed, so you have probably a release of PCBs. There's a phosphate factory destroyed, so you have probably a release of that. So you can already start mapping things and find out if there's a risk to the local population with this information. So that's where open source information has been incredible value. We were working directly with the UN Environment to provide them maps of sites where there was pollution, which was helpful for them because they didn't know that, nobody was looking into that. And it was helpful for journalists because they could find out easily where there were areas of concern where they could look into and go and talk with people.
I think, well, I mean, I think you've actually highlighted many points which I could probably question you on, but like, especially as a journalist who desperately wants to get into this more. But I do want to open the floor up to the audience if anyone has any questions on any of the subjects or any of the panelists. Do we have a microphone, or do we just? Yeah, we do. Okay. I think there's a question here in the front. Here. Yeah. I mean, we'll go there and then we'll go there. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, I have a question for Louise. I was wondering if any of the approaches or strategies that were outlined by Wim just now and the PAX initiative, have you actually used some of these approaches? Have you used PAX, for example? And if not, are there other strategies that you have tried and used and saw that actually were very useful in the specific context of Egypt or the Middle East?
Well, I've been trying to convince Wim to give me a training for a while, so I'm happy you're...
5 p.m., just saying, everyone be there.
I'm happy you're asking this. No, actually not really. I must say that I have a lot to learn in terms of how to use like satellite technology, and this is definitely something I'm planning to do, like in the next year or two, because I think I'm imagining that having access to data will only get more complicated from like the traditional sources. Like we see that it's just getting worse in just 10 years. I'm not expecting it with conflict being probably more violent or at least more regular, that we will have access to this sorts of data. So no, for me it's mostly been like trying to go through either national organisms like scientists, academics, experts, people on the ground, farmers. So trying to patch together stories that would still be valid for the rest of Egypt, but that had a certain element of anecdotal thing to it.
So how often do you have to resort to sources outside of Egypt? Are there enough sources for you within Egypt to reach out to? And if you reach out outside of Egypt, is that valid? Do people believe these sources if they're from somewhere else?
you can have some help there. I mean, you do have a lot of really excellent scientists from Egypt who left Egypt, just because the investments in labs and science is very, very low in research and development. So a lot of them are abroad. So they sometimes conduct research from abroad, so you can have really great information this way. But oftentimes you have to work around this. It's just not straightforward to get the data you need for your work.
Can I just say that I did actually work with Wim on a story on northern Iraq in terms of recruitment of jihadis, and it was essential actually because there are areas that you can't access, and satellite imagery obviously is, you can almost map where the droughts were to where the recruitment bubbles happened. Anyway, but yeah, it's quite when you get into it. But as I said, I think everyone needs to go to the training at 5 p.m. because I think it'll be very interesting. Read the next question.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a question for Louise, but just before I did that, I just wanted to pick up on one thing you said in your introduction, Belle, if I may. A question for Louise, but I just wanted to pick up one thing you said in your introduction, which was you were talking about the UN saying there was 11 years to get things
Pretty much,
in. Yeah, that's not really what they said. They said 11 years to halve global emissions.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean waiting 11 years. That means doing
it
yesterday.
What I meant by 11 years was as in we need to make, I think I said 11 years for serious people to not 11 years to fix the problem, but 11 years do we need to sort of make some serious changes, basically. As I said, I'm not an environmental journalist.
No, the reason I pick up on that is that 11 years to save the planet is a meme that's there since the Guardian first put it, and it's just wrong, basically. It's 11 years to halve global emissions. And that doesn't mean, that means acting yesterday, not 11 years' time.
Exactly. That's what I mean.
The question I wanted to put to Louise was that I was interested in what effect, if any, your activity has actually had on mainstream media in Egypt and neighbouring countries, whether they've started to sort of pick up on these issues because you've been doing them.
So you mean like an impact on the media, or also maybe on civil society, or both? Yeah, I think, okay, just shortly, like in terms of impact, I think at first we were there and we were basically the only journalists who were reporting on some of those issues, and they were actually people organizing in terms of coalitions. Like there was a coalition against coal, there was a coalition against climate change, and all of these things happened, after 2011. So we actually provided a place where they could express themselves. There was an entire conversation about food sovereignty as well, and so it was quite interesting. So in that sense, I think we did feel a purpose that actually we gave them a voice and a space to express themselves. In terms of the impact that we had regionally, it's a bit difficult to assess. Because one of the things that helped us but also made us have less influence, I would say, is that we were in English, in a mostly Arabic-speaking country. So we did have a lot of readers, but that was one of the reasons we could write what we were writing about, but that also limits the amount of people that can actually read your stuff. We didn't have systematic translations at the time of everything. But I think now we're going backwards. I mean, most of this section now has collapsed. It's not even there, and for good reasons. I don't think you can carry an entire environment section in Egypt right now and have enough story and enough people talking to you to just have it there. So this is it. We're going backwards on this. It hasn't stuck. There was a golden period though, because we had one time this incredible environment minister, Mrs. Leila Iskandar, who really created like an entire, like she was close to the activist and she was close to the journalist, and she decided to have like press conferences every week with all the journalists and tell them what was going on, and that was incredible. Like every day I would receive emails on my mailbox, the environment ministry is doing this and that. That was a completely new time. Like we had her WhatsApp and we could just WhatsApp her anytime we wanted comments. I mean, it was unheard of. And this lasted until basically the industry and the lobbies like kicked her out. Like she was a victim of the cement industry too. So it's just, and now we're just going backwards to what we had before. So I don't know really if it's a lasting impact.
Can I bring the microphone over here, if that's okay?
Hi, my name is Jana. I cover sort of the intersection of law, business, and the environment here in Italy and Southern Europe. And something that I think about Italy is that environmental reporting has actually been dangerous for a long time because the mafia is heavily involved in environmental crimes. And so I was wondering if in conflict zones in the Middle East and Northern Africa, if you've encountered sort of criminal activity and if that has actually also kind of heightened the danger involved for you guys.
Does anyone want to?
Yeah, actually, that one of the issues in post-conflict environments or countries is the lack of environmental governance, the lack of environmental law and enforcement of law policies. So, for example, what we saw in Iraq is the heavy industry was being kickstarted after 2003 to create more like economic activities, and there was no regulation. So there was a lot of quicksilver and other heavy metals from industries were dumped into the rivers, like pesticide dumpings were found regularly and just next to roadsides, and contractors were giving pay to get rid of military waste, local contractors, but of course the easiest way was just dump it as well somewhere. So there were issues around industrial accountability, military accountability, scrap metal sites were being used by everyone, even contaminated scrap metal sites. So there was no oversight, nobody took responsibility. So there's also where you saw it, criminal activities flourishing, and also with regards to the export of heavy metals, not heavy metals, scrap metal from military scrap metal and other kind of scrap metal was exported to Turkey and to Jordan. It was a big business because there was a lot of money involved. So of course, and no enforcement and no oversight because it's it's a post-conflict country. So definitely that's one of the issues in conflicts as well. And when it comes to environmental crime, people jump on the bandwagon and try to make money out of the legal vacuum which is there and no enforcement.
Any other questions? Yeah, I think we've got probably time for maybe 2 questions. That's it. At the front, this lady here. Front. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, just because she was before. We've got a few minutes, so we'll keep it brief.
Hello. So I have a question for the 4 of you, actually. I was wondering for you, what would be the most important things journalists who are working on the environment issue should keep in mind when they're working? And also, maybe what would be the next step to improve environment journalism for you?
Sven, do you want to start with?
Yeah, I can just repeat what I've said. Take your environmental journalism to a colleague who covers business, politics, society, and take on one of these big issues together, and ideally work on broad issues cross-border as well on an international level, because I think environment really needs to get on the front page. And one way of doing it is showcasing that it's the climate question, the climate mitigation question is part of all these other stories as well. And I think that's, something I would hope for.
Very briefly, younger generations in conflict-affected countries are now also raising issues. So our partners, like youth groups in Iraq and Syria, are now organizing themselves and addressing environmental issues on the local level, pollution issues, waste management issues, for example, in Kurdistan, water issues in Iraq. So the younger generations everywhere in the world are now holding their own governments accountable. I think that's a very hopeful thing to see, and it's something we should encourage and support where possible, and also should be a lesson learned to prevent future conflicts over natural resources and environment in conflicts, but also in areas which are conflict vulnerable.
I would just add to that, I think also working with organizations that, so for example PACS, but I did a lot of work on water issues that have been fueling a lot of the conflict between Israel and Palestine and Jordan. So EcoPeace, for example, is an organization that looks at trying to actually build peace, this is really boiled down, build peace in those 3 areas using basically the environment. And specifically, I was looking at obviously water resources. But working with, they have 3 directors, one for Palestinian territories, one for Israel, and one for Jordan. Working with the 3 of them together, really opened my eyes to a whole aspect of the conflict, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I'd never seen before. So I think reaching out to organizations is very, very important, because that's what they really focus on it. And also trying to encourage your editor to take this seriously, because it's really important. If you can try and convince your editor, then you can convince your readers. Do we have time for one more question?
I didn't say what I think.
Oh, sorry, goodness, sorry.
No, I think, covering climate change particularly, more than environment, I think is very difficult. So you need to, as Sven said, try to look at it from multiple perspectives as you can, and also really do a lot of research, because there needs to be a lot of nuance in how you write, and I think that's really important. So really spend time with different people, scientists, with farmers, with whoever are the different stakeholders that are involved and important in your story, so you make sure you can have a well-rounded piece and not cut corners too much, because it's easy to do.
Just one more. Can we have one more question? Is that?
We're good, huh? We're good. We still have a few minutes.
Does anyone have there was a man at the back, I think, who wanted to ask a question. Did you? Yeah.
Okay, I'll be very quick. I was just slightly surprised, Sven, when you're saying making it relevant to people's lives. No one has mentioned either extreme weather attribution or changes to lifestyle diets, which are 2 really, really big issues in terms of climate change. Your list didn't include those, and I'd wondered why.
I didn't. Did I or didn't?
Extreme weather events
Yeah.
is really growing.
Yeah, no,
as a
absolutely.
science.
I mean, you know, you can. I have it here on my list actually, and you know, the brevity of time basically cut that out. And yes, you're right. Extreme weather events, obviously, and all the consequences, you know, are a direct impact, and you know, something that you know you need to take into account. Absolutely correct. And lifestyle, I think I mentioned that when I said, you know, are you already affected by climate change or dietary? Yeah, yeah. Which that's what I
That's an entirely different panel,
putting that
so much to
underneath.
talk about.
Yeah.
And the debate, I think there is a great panel to be had for next year, if it's not on this year, how you deal with that on a journalistic level. I totally agree. Because that's, you know, if you have a problem from hell with climate change in general, you know, getting that communicated and worked through as journalists properly without getting everybody, you know, up on the barricades is, I think, a specific question, you know, we all need to look into a bit more, I guess.
Thank you very much for your time, and that's it.